Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today's topic is going to be about editing in Lightroom, or actually re-editing in Lightroom, and the reasons why you might want to go back and look at some of your old photos and actually retouch those things. And I'm actually going to show a rather embarrassing image that I produced about 4 years ago that I'm sure this will come back and bite me later, but I wanted to show anyone makes a progression over a period of time in their photography career, in their taste and all this fun stuff. But what I wanted to first start with is kind of show a very quick image of kind of what the environment looks like here in Vancouver at the moment. It's actually a little bit better today, not by much. We can see a little bit of the sky, but we've been kind of buried in smoke for probably the better part of a week. And I wanted to just quickly show this little snippet. Now these are images from my balcony, essentially, looking over the city about 3 or 4 days ago. And obviously you can tell that we were blanketed with smoke and have been for quite some time. Now, the reason why I'm showing these images is not so much to complain, although I did consider doing a little bit of complaining in here, but it's more to really kind of give I don't want to say a shout out because that's not really the right choice of words, but our hopes and thoughts are with those people who are actually close to or in harm's way of all those fires in the states south of us, in Washington, in Oregon, in California, Colorado, Idaho, all those areas that, if you're looking on a map, looks like the entire western half of the US is burning at the moment. So man, I feel for you guys. I hope you're out of harm's way. I hope you've been able to escape and get away from the fires as best you can, because if we're getting this type of smoke coverage here in Vancouver and we're hundreds of kilometers away from you guys, it's gotta be awful near where you are. Very dangerous, I know, too, and a lot of people have had some pretty serious issues. So please, thoughts, prayers, all those types of things out to everyone. I hope you're okay. So to start the video, I wanted to kind of go over one of the 5 steps of why you might want to go back and re-edit your images. So reason number 1 is your taste change, right? So over time, over several years, the way that you shoot obviously will change, but also what you really like often changes over time. At least it has for me. You know, HDR used to be a big thing back in the day, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Tons of images popping up on Instagram and the like that were HDR'd, some very well done, some quite poorly in my opinion. They looked rather comical in nature, and that was never really the intent of HDR. The HDR is high dynamic range. It's really the desire to create an image that shows everything that's well lit, essentially, right? So if you've got a scenario that's extremely, well, your background, your sky is very bright, but your foreground is dark, you know, obviously the camera has difficulty exposing for all of that, and it goes to what they call an 18% gray card, essentially averages out the scene. Unfortunately, in those scenarios, you'll end up blowing out the background, or your foreground is too dark. HDR would solve that. But that's not really in vogue these days. These days, most people are shooting, they may composite 1 or 2 images together sometimes. But you don't see HDR that much. Those tastes obviously change from a societal perspective. Another reason you might want to go back and re-edit an image is your skills change and improve. So that's not just from a photography perspective, but also from a post-editing perspective. We're gonna spend some time in Lightroom. This video is not gonna just be a talkie video like my last couple. Apologies for that. This time I'm just gonna be yapping away on video. I mean on the computer. So your skills, yes, obviously your skills will change over time. So you learn more about your camera capabilities, you learn more about different post-processing techniques. Maybe you're watching YouTube or Skillshare or whatever else, Creative Live. I have not jumped on Capture One yet, but I just didn't see the real need for that. It's like, look, I finally figured out Lightroom and Photoshop. I'm not gonna jump on another tool. Maybe some people are in that category, who knows. The next one is number 3, whatever you wanna call it. You make or buy a few presets that makes your work more consistent. Yeah, I know presets can sometimes be a controversial topic, and I'm not quite sure why that is, especially if you created them yourself, because you wanted to create a more consistent workflow, a more consistent product that you deliver. So presets are fantastic for that, especially if you're shooting a lot of similar types of scenes. If you're doing a lot of portraiture type work, sometimes maybe you have a certain look and feel that you want to produce that you're posting to Instagram or somewhere else, right? and it's kind of your signature look. So there's nothing wrong with creating presets or leveraging a preset and then modifying it to your tastes and needs. I didn't do that very often way back in the day. I used to just, in my opinion, do a little bit of over editing. Another reason why you might want to go back and re-edit your photos, you decide to create a website and sell all your work on it, and that's something that I'm doing right now. I've just got a website finally up and running, and I'm going to put the link in the description, so feel free to go on. Hey, if you want to buy something, that's fantastic too, but that's not what this video is about. And I'm also going to produce a separate video on kind of how that whole process works using a certain company for that website development. And finally, you want to post some non-income producing photos on stock websites perhaps. Maybe you've got a whole set of photos that they've just been sitting on your computer, and this is what most people will say, obviously, for stock photos. If they're not making you any money, why not go back, tweak them a little bit to make them nicer for a stock photo website like Shutterstock or Adobe Stocksy or Alamy, which I'm not that familiar with. Dreamstime and iStock. iStock's a big one too. I've done a few of used a few of the stock photo websites. One of the reasons why I think I wasn't making any money, and this is something that you'll see as you're uploading your images to these stock photo websites, is that if you've over edited them, if you've introduced some grain into the image or whatever, they sometimes will not be accepted. So that's yet another reason why you might want to go back and re-edit those things over time or revisit a photo that you took many years ago. Now that you've got a little bit different perspective, and you might want to post them on the stock photo website. So that's it for the intro. We're going to hop on the computer now, and I'm going to walk you through some tips and tricks, hopefully that are helpful when you're in Lightroom. For me personally, I use Lightroom a lot for landscape type photos, but I don't use it hardly at all for portraiture work. I will go in and make a few little edits. If you're underexposing your image, you don't have a flash that you're using at the time, and so a lot of people will just kind of underexpose that image. You can do a few little edits in there, but I don't feel like it's super strong when it comes to skin. So I will go often into Photoshop and do almost all my edits, especially on skin in Photoshop. But today is primarily focused on a really, what I would say, an awful image that I produced about 4 years ago, way over edited. Just it's an almost embarrassment after you finish laughing at looking at how bad I was about 4 or 5 years ago. So we're gonna hop on the computer.
We are back, and I thought we'd start with the before image, and then I'll show you the monstrosity of the after edited image that I created a number of years ago. I think I originally shot this image on Lake Conroe about 4 years ago probably. And so this is the before image right here. And this is the terrible after image that I created, like I said, 4 years ago. Gosh, this is just rough to even look at now. Contrast is just off the charts. Like I said, I've gone way overboard on the saturation, among other things in here, probably on the clarity, I would imagine. This is what we want to go back and essentially re-edit. One of the first steps that I always do, if I go back into Photoshop and I have an image that I want to edit these days. I didn't do this before. What you want to do is you want to create a virtual copy of your original image. That way you have a non-destructive copy of that image that you can work off of. Now, not everybody does this. It's not always required, but I think it's a pretty good modus operandi, if you will, of editing your images. So here you see I've created that virtual copy right there. If you didn't see it before, I just right-clicked on it, create virtual copy. And you can always tell it's a virtual copy by this little flipped corner of the page here. And by the way, I'm going to split all these up into chapters in the description. So for those of you who are very familiar with Lightroom and some of the things that I will be working on, then you can skip way ahead to perhaps some other section that you might find more interesting. This is what I'm going to work on, is the virtual copy right here. One of the first things that I like to do, if you had made modifications to the image, when you create the virtual copy, it'll pull those modifications over. So a lot of times what I'll just go ahead and do is just click on the reset button over here, and that resets everything back to the original settings when you took the image. And when I took this image, like I said, 4 years ago, you'll see that I had shot the temperature at around 4,500 Kelvin, which is a little blue for me. So that might be one of the first things that I would start with on this image, is to adjust that. Now I'll normally pull this up into what I would think would be more of a daylight type setting, maybe around 52, 5400 Kelvin. Of course, this is personal preference. That's pretty close to probably the original colors of the image when it was shot. If you wanted to go a little warmer, you could just bump it up in the 5700 range, maybe something like that. That might be pushing it just a tiny bit, but I'm thinking maybe somewhere around 52 to 50. Yeah, let's go 5400 Kelvin. All right, one of the original things that I also do when I start with almost every image these days, and I've seen other photographers do this as well, so I think it's a pretty good method to kind of approach your image editing in Lightroom, is to click on your remote chromatic aberration and also the enable profile corrections. So this was shot with the 16 to 35 Nikon lens. You know, sometimes it has a bit of an issue with distortion at the 16 millimeter range. Now, I shot this at 35 millimeters, you can see here, so probably not going to get a lot of a distortion. So this is really probably not doing a whole lot of adjustment to the image. If it had been shot at 16 millimeters, that probably would have made some impact to the image, kind of flattened it out and adjusted some of the distortion. So, okay, so we've created a virtual copy. We have added chromatic aberration and profile corrections to the image to adjust for any distortions that that particular lens might have. And if you don't have that built in, you know, if you've got a new lens, if you've got a Sony or maybe a G Master, maybe that is not included in Lightroom. But to the best of my knowledge, most of the newer lenses that have been out within the last, I wouldn't say 90 days or so, probably should be in Lightroom. So you probably would be in good shape. All right, so let's go to leveling option here. One of the things you can kind of see in this image is that I was probably on a slightly unlevel piece of land here in the foreground with my tripod. So there's two ways to adjust your horizon line in Lightroom. I've seen a couple people do it this way. I choose to do it a slightly different way, but this is a great way to do it as well. So click on your crop overlay option here, just under original photo, and click on the angle. You want to make sure that you click on the constrain to image button here, or checkbox, and then let's go ahead and do our angle then. So what that does is it kind of keeps the image intact, if you will, when you're making those changes. So let's do that again. So we're going to just drag that across here, and you're just going to drag it along the horizon line the way it currently is flowing from kind of left to right. And you'll see how it makes a slight adjustment, and that basically corrects our horizon line there. But you can still see that it looks like our lighthouse is a little bit askew. So the other way to make your adjustments to the horizon to make it level is to use the, I'm just going to go ahead and say done here, and we'll just go with what we've got there, right? So you can see that that's nice and horizontal there, our horizon. The other option is to go down here to transform, and you see under transform I also already have the constrain crop checkbox checked, and you can use your rotate option here. Now I'm just going to do this just quickly, and this is one way to rotate your horizon, essentially left or right, and you can just see that number going back and forth over here on the right hand side. That's one other option to adjust your horizon line. So whichever one you choose, I don't know that there's one that's necessarily advantageous over the other. I have seen some people try to use this auto upright option here. I think that works sporadically. I have not had a lot of really good success with that, so I would steer clear of that personally. You know, to each their own, whatever works. So one other option to adjust your angle here of this lighthouse, you see, like I said, it looks a little slightly askew to the right, is to work with your vertical lines. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag this slider to the right just a little bit, and you can see how those vertical lines kind of line up on the left hand side there to show that the lighthouse is now in alignment with the vertical lines. And if I let that go, and you'll see there, it looks to me, just by eyeballing it, that lighthouse looks fantastic now. It looks straight up and down vertical, pretty much exactly what we would want for something along those lines. This works for buildings and for other types of structures that might get slightly distorted depending upon the lens that you're using. We've corrected that. I think what I've also seen a lot of people do, maybe it's not necessarily a mistake per se. Now this image, I don't know that I'm going to crop very much. There is absolutely nothing wrong with making any kind of modification that you want to the crop to get it to kind of adhere to the aspect ratio that you want. Now you can click on this custom aspect ratio over here, and if let's say you wanted to go with a 16:9 aspect ratio, this is one way to do that. So let's say if I went with that option, you could see that I could kind of drag and drop the image there to adhere to a 16:9 aspect ratio if you were so inclined. I'm not personally, because I want to keep some of the foreground in play, so I'm just going to go back to custom, and I'm just going to drag this down just a wee bit. Let's unlock that. There we go. Probably about right there is good for me as far as cropping is concerned. I don't want to, obviously don't want to lop off anything in the Lighthouse. We do want to kind of crop that just a wee bit. All right, so let's go back to this a little bit more. There we go. And I think that probably, for at least from my eyes, is pretty good. All right, so that is our image. We've not made any real color corrections or anything else to the image at this point. We've simply just adjusted our horizon lines, fixed the kind of the vertical issue with the Lighthouse, and now, so let's start making the overall image adjustments, and then we'll kind of go into the specialized tools that you can start to do with the individual areas of the image. But these image adjustments are going to affect the image as a whole. So one of the things I like to do is kind of bump up my clarity just a wee bit. Now I used to bump this up pretty far before, but I tend not to really like that much anymore. So 13 is probably about the highest I ever go with a clarity adjustment on an image nowadays. Maybe that with your camera it may not be, maybe different. If you have these newer lenses, gosh, you don't even really need to bump up the clarity much anymore. They're just so super sharp. But the older images, or the older lenses I should say, you might want to do that. Now I also tend to do a little bit of dehaze. I like that just to kind of give it a clearer look, and we'll use that a little bit more a little bit later on, and I'll show you where I like to use that better. But I'll bump my dehaze up just a tiny bit, and I like to go with my vibrance a little bit more, and I tend to kind of bump down my saturation just a tiny bit. So let's bump our vibrance up to maybe 7, and for this image I might bump my blacks down just a tiny bit. I like to have those a little bit darker, and I might bump up my shadows. This is for the image overall, and I'm bumping those up quite a bit. And obviously one of the things that I haven't done is to bump up the exposure. Now this image was very dark. It was a 2.5 second duration when I shot this. Let's go ahead and bump up our exposure, and that's probably about right from my eyes. Hopefully everybody is feeling the same. We are going to darken certain sections of the image after this, but I like that exposure from here, and I'm gonna bump our highlights down. Our sky darkens a tad, and we'll do that a little bit more here in just a second as well. All right, so I like that. That is getting us closer to what the original image probably looked like. Let's look at our tone curve. That's normally kind of my next step in the image adjustment realm. Now I like to go with a little bit, it depends on the image of course, but I'm going to bump my darks down just a tiny bit here because it gives you more of a richness to the image, I think. I'm going to bump my shadows up in the tone curve just a tiny bit. You see I just bump up just by +6 or so. Now I'm going to bump my lights up a tad. 15, and my highlights I'm just going to pull down again. Okay, so that looks pretty good. One of the sections that I like to go with now to do my image editing. Now let's take out some of these spots first. I think that's probably going to be a good place to start. A lot of people think that you've got to go to Photoshop to get rid of any spots that might have shown up on the lens or in the sensor, and I suspect this was on the sensor when I shot this image years ago. We have a spot removal tool right here, and this guy is very highly effective. All you have to do is just click on spot removal as I just did, and click on your individual spot, and you'll see that it picks a spot. Now you can rotate that around if you don't, well, you can rotate the size of it of course and move that around if you don't like that particular position, but I think that's probably fine. And let's go ahead and get these spots out of the way up in the left hand corner, and looks like there's one there. So I'm just going to go with what Lightroom is suggesting. I think I'm perfectly fine with those suggestions. Anybody see any other spots here? That one looks like a spot to me. Let's get rid of that guy. So our spots are removed. One of the things that I like to do, and then there's a couple ways to do this, I like to go with my graduated filter. One option is to just click on your graduated filter and click on all the settings that you would like to set that as. So now it's picking up some of the settings that I normally go with from a sky perspective. So I normally like to bump up my contrast just a little bit. Sometimes I will bump up my shadows, sometimes I won't. Let's bump those down just a tiny bit. I will typically bump my blacks down, and I will go with clarity and dehaze here, that these are set somewhere around the range that I like to go with for the sky in particular. For this sky, it really just depends on the sky. I think I'm going to go with a little bit warmer color here. So you see how I've got that bumped up to +8. And so I'm just going to drag my graduated filter down here this here shows you the extent of how far your graduated filter is going to go down, right? So it's only going to apply to the sky essentially. Now it looks like you can see we're in the red here that it's picking up a little bit of the land. So I'm going to pull that back up just a tiny bit. There we go. So it's not picking up our boats in the foreground. I want to do something slightly different with those. So we've dragged our graduated filter down. Let's take a look and see what that looks like after we've made our corrections. Now, to my eyes, that is at a vast improvement to what we had before. Now we want to probably just do our foreground. So let's go with our graduated filter again, and to reset your original settings there, you just double click on effect and that will reset everything for you. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bump up my highlights a little bit in the water and bump up my exposure, bump up the shadows, and probably the blacks here as well, and the clarity. Let's do a little tad bit of dehaze. I don't know that we really need much saturation, honestly. It's really more going to be the shadows that we're going to be pulling out here in the boots. We're going to do the same thing. We're just dragging our graduated filter. Now, one of the cool things about this graduated filter is you can kind of angle it, if you will. So if you don't want to get, if it's not just a straight line that you're trying to do, then you can just kind of angle it. So I've done that just a wee bit here. On other images, normally I'll come in from the sides sometimes if I've got trees in the foreground. But so there we go. We've set our graduated filter. It looks like it's not really getting into the sky at all. It's really just picking up our boats. See how that red color kind of moves up to right there? I think that's probably okay. All right. So let's see what that looks like. Okay, I think that looks pretty darn good. Now I think we might bump up our exposure a little bit. So I'm going to go back to that graduated filter and I am going to bump up our exposure a tad bit more, and then also our highlights and our shadows just a tiny bit more. There we go. So that's looking pretty good. One thing, yeah, let's bump up our shadows maybe just a tiny bit more while I'm at it. That's our shadows at 30. And there we go. I think it looks pretty good. Oh yeah, I want to go with a little bit bluer color. So let's click on our graduated filter a little bit more. And let's bump that down just a tad bit. I want to go with slightly bluer color. There we go. So I think that looks pretty good. Far superior already, I think, to the image that we had before. Hopefully everyone is in agreement with that. And one other thing I wanted to show you guys, if you are interested, is this cool little radial filter. Now a lot of people don't use this that much. I use this quite often for portrait work, to lighten the skin and that kind of thing. But what we could do is, I think our lighthouse is a tad bit dark. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this down. And we're just going to focus on the lighthouse, and we're just going to try to squeeze that guy in there. Now one thing you will notice that it defaults to making all the adjustments to the outside of the radial filter, not inside. So what you want to do is you want to click on this little invert checkbox right here. So it applies all the adjustments to just the lighthouse. So I'm going to try to isolate that down to probably right there, because I don't want to adjust my actual light too much. There we go, right there. So I'm going to squeeze that down so we don't get too much on the outsides of that. There we go. This is one way to do it, and there's another way to do it here in just a second. I can kind of show you really quick too. I like our exposure, I like our highlights, I like our shadows. The blacks, I think, yeah, that's good too. Clarity and dehaze are all good. Saturation, yeah, we can bump that up just a tiny bit. Okay, perfect. All right, so our radial filter is going to make only those changes to just that section of the lighthouse. So there we go. So you can see that the lighthouse is kind of shown a lot more than it was before. Now, one thing we could do is bump up the lights even more. I don't know that we need to go crazy with that. Maybe we'll go back to that and just bump up our highlights a tad bit more and our shadows a little bit more and see what that looks like. There we go. I think that's probably pretty good. You don't want to go too overboard because it was definitely dark in the original image. So we've made these adjustments. Now these adjustments are normally for a range or area within your image. The only other way, I say only other, another way to make adjustments to the image is almost to do it as a type of paintbrush, which is really super cool. A lot of people don't leverage this option, is the adjustment brush right here. So you see the adjustment brush allows you to make spot type image or corrections, if you will, to certain parts of the image. So one thing I did notice, it looks like our little pontoon boat right over here is a little dark, probably because it's just a little bit farther away from the light source. So let's let's just adjust, and I'm going to bump our exposure up just a tiny bit on that, and maybe, I don't know that we necessarily need to do any kind of color correction on that pontoon boat. I don't know that we need to adjust our contrast. Okay, so what we can do is just make some slight adjustment brush strokes here to just that portion of the boat. Now I've got this in red just so you can see exactly where I'm making those adjustments. You can turn that off. A lot of people do. Personally, I like to see exactly where I'm making the adjustments. And then click on done. And you see that we've basically lightened that boat up. But just that little small section of the boat is all we did to lighten that up. Sometimes what I'll do, let's say if you wanted to, you could go in and adjust, say, the trees or something like that. Kind of bump up the lighting in our trees. So to me, this kind of gives you this massive power over your image to just kind of dodge and burn the individual areas of the image that you want to focus on without having to affect everything else. Pretty huge, right? So you can see how we've really lit that tree up now to where it's much more detailed. Super cool in my eyes. Now everything else I think is getting closer to what I would probably want. Now there's a couple of other adjustments that I would typically make when I would go back to adjust an image that I have done 3 or 4 years ago. And that is making some slight adjustments to our HSL area here. So that's our hue, saturation, and luminance. And one cool little tip, if you want to kind of bring out the colors in the sky, you can bump your luminance down on the aqua and the blue, and that will darken up the sky. Now probably not so much in this one because our sky is kind of more, I don't know, kind of more grayish, if you will. So I'm not seeing a whole lot of adjustment. We're picking up some colors in there. I also like to bump up sometimes the saturation just a tiny bit on my oranges and my yellows in the sunset, and perhaps my reds, right? So that just kind of makes those colors pop a little bit more. One other thing that we could probably do, and I'm just kind of eyeballing this, let's say we did our adjustment brush. Now here's some split toning options here too. Now this is something I also like to do. I will adjust my highlights a tad bit, and I will put them into the range that I think probably was the most accurate for that evening. And I think somewhere around this color range is probably the most accurate. Probably somewhere around that range would be my guess. And the same thing with our shadows. Yeah, somewhere around there, and I'm going to bump our saturation just a tiny bit down. Okay, so that's pretty close, at least in my eyes. A couple other adjustments I might want to do is I might want to adjust just the clouds. They're a little darker than what I might like. I want to bump, let's see, I'm going to bump my warmth up on that. This is, I'm just clicking on my adjustment brush. I'm not, like I said, I'm not going too overboard with this. So let's just see what this looks like. I am just going to paint over some of these clouds, and let's see what that looks like. So I want to kind of bring out some of the details in those clouds. You can see kind of what I'm doing there. Now to me, this just gives your image the personal touch that you know, not many people would maybe go this far on. And I'm not saying that it's absolutely the perfect way to go about it, but I think that it is a nice way to really capture exactly what you were looking for in that image. All right, so let's just see what that looks like. Okay, yeah, so I think you can see a little bit more detail in those clouds. Pulled out a little bit more of the warmth and the sun right in there. Now I might do that again. I'm going to pull the warmth. I'm just going to focus on the warmth there, and I'm going to bump my blacks down just a tiny bit, just on that orange layer there. Let's just see what that looks like. Right through there, right? Okay, yeah, there we go. Pretty cool. I like that. And that's pretty much it. So let's take a look at what we've done with this image. Oh yeah, let's look one more thing here. I want to bump my highlights down just a tiny bit to show the rays from the lighthouse coming out of the top of that lighthouse. So I'm going to do that also with an adjustment brush, and I think that's probably a bit much on the warmth, but blacks are fine. Let's bump our highlights down, and let's just see what that looks like right there. So I'm just making some slight adjustments right there along the lighthouse, right along with the rays. Yeah, like right there. Let's see what that looks like. And I'm going up above here on the top of my adjustment brush, and let's just see what that looks like. There we go. So I think for the most part, that's accentuating the rays. I could go a little bit farther if I really wanted to, but I think personally, I think that's fine. And that's probably it. Let's look at one other thing. If you didn't like the highlights and the rocks, you could bring those down with a separate graduated filter if you wanted to here. I think, in my opinion, that's a little bit bright, but a little bit distracting, but I don't think it's horrible. So let's just compare what we have here, what we've gone back and adjusted or re-edited this image. And you see that there's not a whole lot of grain in the image at all, right? Because I didn't go overboard with anything. But if you look at this image compared to this monstrosity, what a difference, right? So in my opinion, this is our new image is far superior to that image. Yeah, so I think that is a pretty decent image. So that's it. Like I said in the intro, there's a vast number of reasons why you might go back and edit your older photos. It really just depends on kind of the time that you have and the application on what you might be using those images for. Yeah, you got a lot of options. You know, if you wanted to go back and post like this type of image, you might actually make it into a stock photo site, but I can guarantee you that image is going nowhere. Like I said, I have no idea what I was thinking at that time. So that's it, folks, and I hope you enjoyed that, and we will talk to you soon. Have a great day.